Welcome to our extended coverage of the Noor Salman trial right here on clickorlando.com. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matt Austin. Just hours ago, the fifth day of jury selection wrapped up, and late this afternoon, we learned the judge hopes to have the 60 prospective jurors by Friday before dwindling that number down to 12. Already, we're two-thirds of the way there, with 76 people have been questioned. 42 of those people have been put in the potential jury pool. Let's get you out to News 6 investigator Mike DeForest. Mike, today several jurors were dismissed for a variety of reasons.
There are, and you have to understand this jury selection process. These people, they're kind of coming in here, some of them a little bit nervous, facing the judge and the attorneys, and the judge is really trying to get to their core as quickly and as efficiently as possible to find out if they have any biases. And it doesn't mean that they're a biased person, as the judge will repeatedly tell them. It just means that they may have something in their life that they may not be best suited for this case. Like, for example, today, one person who was allowed into the jury pool was a Navy veteran. He'd been in the Navy for about 20 years, said he knew a little bit about the Pulse nightclub attack and felt that he could be a fair juror. Another person we'll get into a little bit in a moment here is a woman whose father, as long as she's known him, has been a federal law enforcement agent working undercover. And even though she knows intimately about the law enforcement field, she said she could set that aside and be a fair juror. Contrast that with one of the later jurors we heard today, who actually was dismissed from consideration. He is a chaplain who works with a lot of law enforcement agencies, goes to a lot of police officer funerals, sadly, and he says that he has such a close relationship with law enforcement, he didn't think he could be a fair juror, that he might take in that appreciation of law enforcement into consideration and perhaps not give the evidence the proper look that it deserves. So that's just kind of what we're dealing with. I want to bring in right now attorney Whitney Bone joining us here. A little bit windy out here tonight. I imagine for you, jury selection process has got to be fascinating, but also nerve-wracking.
It is. It's extremely fascinating to watch this, and it's extremely fascinating to do jury selection, because who ends up being on the jury has basically everything to do with what ends up being the verdict in the trial. So in this case, it's very interesting to see who's up for consideration. We're not at the phase where we're at the final selection for jurors, but who's disqualified and who's still eligible to be chosen from to be on this jury.
Now, today was one of the first times we really heard from someone who had law enforcement in their family. And we talk about this woman. I think she worked as a nurse in an emergency room nowhere near Orlando, a little bit further away. But she said that, yeah, her father worked as an undercover agent. And so you imagine, you're growing up with dad, you know all of dad's buddies, you know what it's like to be a cop. If you're either a prosecutor or a defense attorney, how are you looking at someone like her who understands law enforcement?
Well, I mean, that can cut both ways. In other words, it could be from the defense perspective. This is somebody who can look at a law enforcement officer and determine, you know, I know law enforcement officers and I know they're human. I know they make mistakes, and I know that they are subject to the same human frailties as any other human being is in terms of mistakes, perception, biases, things of that nature. But at the same time, you could look at that as someone who thinks, you know, if it comes down to a credibility determination between a law enforcement officer and someone who's non-law enforcement, that I would give the benefit of the doubt to law enforcement, or I'd be more likely to believe what they say to be true because I have such a close relationship with law enforcement and maybe an undying respect for them.
Now, one of the things the attorney is also, or the judge and the attorneys are really screening for in this, is how much media exposure these potential jurors have had regarding not just the Pulse nightclub attack, but Noor Salman's later arrest. And even though when they received questionnaires months ago, the judge instructed them, try to avoid media, understanding that sometimes you can be in a doctor's office or the airport and can't miss it. There was one prospective juror today who admitted that she still watches the morning news, even though she was told to try to avoid it. And as a result, she knew about big developments that we first reported over here 2 days ago. The big picture was that it came out in a defense filing that Omar Mateen had been at Walt Disney World only about 90 minutes before the Pulse attack, and then just 25 minutes before the Pulse attack, he was over at a different nightclub here in Orlando, one that doesn't specifically cater to the LGBT community. The reason the defense filed this motion is they do not want prosecutors during opening statements to mention that perhaps this was an attack on the gay community. We haven't gotten to talk to your thoughts yet, on this defense motion, we're still waiting to hear from prosecutors on how they're going to respond to this.
Sure, it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it is a very bold and important move by the defense in terms of, they're laying out here, these are the flaws you can expect to see in the government's case. And specifically, how could it have been that this was even a target on a gay community, but specifically, how did Ms. Salman know that? If Mr. Mateen seemed to have made a last-minute decision to change from going to a nightclub that wasn't for gay population specifically, and had searched on Google specifically for Orlando nightclubs, not Orlando gay nightclubs. And so what we're seeing at this point is the defense's way of saying, Judge, we want to be careful about not inflaming the jury here and not trying to seek sympathies from them or to poison their minds in a way that isn't appropriate because the government doesn't have evidence to support it. This is a big move, though, and certainly it'll be very interesting to see if the government can actually substantiate anything to show that this was a specific target on the gay community, but then even more than that, if Noor Salman had any reason to know that.
Now, it's interesting. This motion on its face is strictly asking the judge, hey, Judge, can you limit what the prosecutors say during opening statements? That's the basis when they filed this a couple days ago. But as we were discussing earlier, I'm not saying that the defense had an ulterior motive by filing this and putting so much detail into it. Certainly, I don't think they wanted necessarily a prospective juror like the one we heard here today to be able to regurgitate what was in that motion. However, it really does kind of outline what they feel perhaps the weakness may be of the government's case.
Well, and it outlines it in a very confident way because it appears that the forensic evidence is what the forensic evidence is as to that issue, as far as there is no dispute about what Omar Mateen searched for or where he went that night. That's not being disputed here. And so it's a very bold move to go ahead and put it out there. It's very effective and high level, competent criminal defense litigation in terms of this is what his or her lawyer should be doing, but certainly it also it puts us all on notice. This is not as clear cut as anyone maybe would like to have thought it would be. We'll see if the government can do anything in terms of rebutting that once we get into the evidence part of the trial.
And we are waiting to see what the government may have a response to this. I did see that they filed a sealed motion. So much in this federal case, because of the sensitive nature of this and because of the high-profile nature of this, a lot of the court records have been sealed. I, as a journalist, am not as familiar with that. I know as an attorney, though, I imagine in some of these cases that's
not uncommon.
And what would be some of the other reasons why to keep these sealed?
Well, if it has information that's sensitive in terms of medical information. So, for instance, when Ms. Salman was evaluated by doctors in terms of trying to determine relevance of certain defenses she might have as being a battered woman or her psychological state when she was interrogated by police. That sort of information is not readily available to the public. There's other situations where maybe there's sensitive information about witnesses or law enforcement officers that it's just not appropriate in terms of compromising ongoing investigations that certain law enforcement officers might be involved in, where that information would be known to the public. There's other situations as well. Certainly federal court is a lot different than what you see in state or county court, where everything is more public information because it falls under Florida laws and the Sunshine Laws. This is different. This is federal laws, and they don't have the same open records that we're accustomed to seeing in state courts in Florida.
Where we are meant to see it is in that courtroom, and that's where we will be. And it does look like the opening statements in this case will begin likely the middle of next week. The judge really thinks that this pace of jury selection has been a slow process, but he really thinks that they can start winnowing this down to the final 12 jurors plus alternates probably by Monday or Tuesday. So that's what's next. Attorney Whitney Bone, thank you so much for joining us here. She's going to be joining us throughout our coverage of the Noor Salman trial here on clickorlando.com and on News 6. So we're going to send it back to you, Matt.
Mike DeForest, live for us. Thank you very much. Our coverage of this trial continues online. Tonight we have a special page detailing everything on clickorlando.com.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
/Noor Salman tab. And don't forget, we have a team of reporters in the courtroom for the latest. Head to twitter.com/News6 Pulse Trial and join us tomorrow morning for another discussion. Our coverage begins at 8:30 right here on clickorlando.com. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Matt Austin. Have a great one.